When analyzing the story of Dear Esther, it should be noted that neither the images presented to the player nor the narration spoken are entirely reliable. The narrator freely admits to either forgetting or mixing up various events and when they happened. Likewise, the seemingly disjointed or illogical positioning of items on the island also give the player a sense of a situation where not everything may be as it appears. So, in approaching this piece of interactive art, we should keep this potential ambiguity in mind as we try to interpret both what we encounter as the player and how we assemble the story events as told through the narrator. As I previously did for the Let's Play of The Path, I will try to analyze this game from both a narrative and a symbolic perspective. It should also be noted that this analysis comes from multiple playthroughs of the game, as only a fraction of the total amount of narrative lines are spoken during any single playthrough. If we assume that the story of Dear Esther is one of an actual sequence of events, we find it to be a tale of a diseased and mentally broken man who seeks a lonely place in which to end his days and find freedom from his afflictions in death. From the pieces of information provided within the game, it seems that the history of the Hebridean island in which the story is set begins with the Hermit, a mythical figure who came to the island seeking solitude in its purest form. According to the island's inhabitants who came later, when this hermit first traveled to the island, he intentionally made a hole in the bottom of his boat in order to speak with the creatures of the sea. Upon reaching the shore, he then threw his arms wide and created his own cave in the island's rock in order to make his dwelling place. The ultimate fate of this hermit is not told, but it appears that the game's narrator envies or idolizes this person of legend for his contentment with the solitary world in which he lives, a contentment that the narrator finds impossible to obtain for himself. Some undetermined amount of time after the hermit came to the island, a Scandinavian shepherd by the name of Jakobsen became the first of several non-legendary immigrants to the island. He was credited with constructing the bothy in which the narrator spends some of his nights, and it is believed that Jakobsen did this in order to become a man of property, and thus earn himself both a wife and a financially secure future for himself. However, through some disease or malady, perhaps originating back to a birth defect that left his ribs misshapen, the shepherd Jakobsen dies after only 2 years on the island, and his herds are left to wander about the landscape. Both the stories of the hermit and of shepherd Jakobsen are recorded by a writer and explorer by the name of Donnelly. Donnelly's exact motives for traveling to the island are unknown, but the narrator wonders if some similar mix of disease and sorrow might have also driven the writer to the island in search of some kind of solace. Donnelly finds the island's remaining inhabitants to be wretched, suggesting that they are cursed by God, and have little or no redeeming qualities beyond the stories they can tell him. At some point, either before, during, or after his visit to the island, Donnelly contracts syphilis, which eventually destroys his mind. As the disease claims him, he finishes his book on the island, though the latter parts are composed of confused information and ramblings caused by the author's final illness. Over some unknown amount of years after Donnelly's death, the original inhabitants of the island either die off or move on. The island is then used at some point as a small port, but even that is eventually abandoned, so that, by the time the narrator comes to visit the island, he is completely alone. With him, the narrator brings a copy of Donnelly's book, which he has stolen from the local library back at his home in Britain. It is unclear how many times the narrator has visited the island previously, but the evidence suggests that this final visit is explicitly for the purpose of perishing on the island. Through the narrator's reflections, it seems that he lost his wife, Esther, as the result of a car crash on the M5 motorway somewhere between the communities of Wolverhampton and Exeter. The crash involved a second vehicle driven by a man named Paul. Alcohol seems to have been a factor in the crash, as the narrator, Esther, and Paul had all been drinking before the accident. Paul worked as a pharmacist and was coming back from a work-related conference when the accident occurred. By a strange coincidence, Paul's surname is Jakobson, suggesting that he may have been a distant descendant of the same family as the ill-fated shepherd. It is also suggested that Paul may have been seriously injured in the crash and required resuscitation, although the narrator is not wholly clear on this point. Another ambiguous detail is whether or not Esther had been pregnant at the time she was killed. Upon her death, Esther is cremated, as the narrator cannot bear the thought of putting his wife into the cold ground. The crash seems to have been a turning point in the narrator's life, and it is suggested that he cannot move beyond his wife's death and is desperate to be with her again. Aside from the accident, the narrator recalls two distinctive events regarding Esther. First, that she once related to him how she had been born with a sizable birthmark, which led the doctors in the delivery room to fall silent in astonishment. The baby Esther then cried loudly in order to, according to the narrator, fill in the void. The narrator notes fondly that his wife continued to fill in voids throughout her life, possibly hinting at how much of a hole is left in the narrator's life as a result of Esther's death. The second event mentioned occurred when the narrator had kidney stones and his wife visited him in the hospital, being present when he emerged from anesthesia. In this circumstance, he saw her as bringing him up out of the dark depths, figuratively either causing or aiding his resurrection from a death-like sleep. As it is eventually revealed that Esther's maiden name was Donnelly, she, like Paul, might have been distantly related to a figure from the island's history. This may be the primary motivator for the narrator's journey to the island, in an attempt to be near anything even remotely connected to his lost wife. During his visit to the island, the narrator finds himself alone, save for some wrecked boats, abandoned buildings, a few shorebirds, and a radio antenna constructed upon the highest peak. The narrator spends nights both at the abandoned lighthouse and the Jakobson bothy before deciding to seek out the caves that the hermit supposedly created, but that the writer Donnelly never found. Along his journey, the narrator uses a supply of luminescent paint to scrawl images upon the walls and rocks of the island. It is hinted that the paint was created by the company that Paul Jakobson works for. The two primary symbols are organic molecules, such as alcohol, interacting with nerve cells, and electrical diagrams that may be a part of a car's anti-lock braking system. Both types of images recall the circumstances that led to the car crash that killed his wife. Upon reaching the caves, the narrator slips and falls, thus injuring his leg. The injury leads to an infection that begins to spread upwards towards his heart. In his last days, the narrator travels through the caves and then ascends up to the radio antenna. During his exploration of the island, the narrator writes letters to his deceased wife as if she was still alive. But just before his final ascent, he folds the letters into paper boats and sets them to sail on the island shoreline near a ruined dock. Upon reaching his destination, the narrator jumps from the top of the antenna, imagining himself becoming a bird, flying up to rejoin his wife and be free of his misery and suffering. More than anything else, the story of Dear Esther features images of traveling, movement, and transition. From the car parts scattered across the island to the boats, the lighthouse, and the buoy, there are many such symbols associated with transportation and journeying from one place to another. The journey of the actual player also suggests transition, as each chapter moves the player to a new, uniquely crafted environment. At the beginning of the game, the player appears to emerge from the ocean onto the land, only to ascend as a bird into the sky at the game's conclusion. The numerous references of the Apostle Paul's revelation on the road to Damascus, found in the biblical book of Acts, also follows this theme, where a person on a journey experiences a moment of profound transformation. Of course, the ultimate transition in the human experience is the passage from life to death. We see this in the use of light sources during the game. The player starts out at a broken lighthouse, which is accessible but possesses no light of its own. Later, the buoy has a light, but is distant and unattainable. The light of the caves, on the other hand, is attainable, but also confined and limited. The light of the candles along the final shoreline reveal the ghosts of the past, but offer no hopeful future. Only at the beacon does the player find a light that offers freedom. A symbol of death is released from the inevitable decays of life. There are also numerous signs of loss, grief, and mourning on the island. Broken ships, bloody surgeon tools, empty beds, small shrines with old photographs, and wandering spirits lurking in the shadows. This adds to the overall hopelessness that pervades the island for most of the game. Much of the island seems to resemble the narrator himself, a place that is dilapidated and dying. Standing stones litter the landscape, reminding the narrator of the pain he had experienced due to his own kidney stones. Lines in the rocky cliffs end up looking very much both like the lines of infection that claim his injured leg, as well as the tire tracks of vehicles that recall the accident that killed his wife. Like the narrator, the island is forlorn and diseased, and now stands alone without any clear hope of redemption. However, the final transition of the player into a bird at the end of the game offers a renewed feeling of hope. There is a sense that the journey continues even after death, and that dying itself is just another transition into something else, rather than a final ending. Throughout the game, it is never clear whether the player is actually the narrator or some unnamed soul traveling the same journey. Yet, in the end, I personally find this distinction largely irrelevant to the experience. I believe that the game is meant for the player to experience it directly, with no need to play any particular role within the game's world. Dear Esther allows the player to treat the game both as a story to unravel, as well as a means by which to reflect on the subjects of grief and both the fear and hope of life's transitions. I hope that in the future more artists will use the medium of interactive games to create experiences that invite the player to think and experience things on a deeper level, rather than rely solely on the more shallow and instantly gratifying game models that are so prevalent for the industry in general. Just like an engrossing book or a well-thought-out film, games like Dear Esther allow you not only to lose yourself within a fantastic environment, but also grant you a chance to actually become enriched by the experience and emerge on the other side feeling that you have gained something. Something intangible perhaps, but also truly valuable.